They were slaves, who became the most feared soldiers in the world. Christian boys, torn from their families, converted, trained, and turned into the Ottoman Empire's ultimate weapon. Men so disciplined, they conquered Constantinople, crushed armies across 3 continents, and had no families, no property, and supposedly no loyalty except to the Sultan himself. For 300 years, they were untouchable. And then, in a single bloody afternoon, in 1826, an Ottoman Sultan wiped out his own army, because the soldiers who once built the empire had become the very thing threatening to destroy it. This is the story of the Janissaries. If military history, that reads like it shouldn't be real, is your thing, hit subscribe now, because this channel exists to bring you the stories textbooks skip over. The story of the Janissaries begins in the 1300s, in the earliest decades of the Ottoman state, when the empire was still a small, but rapidly expanding power. In Anatolia and the Balkans, Ottoman sultans faced a persistent problem, familiar to every conqueror in history. How do you build an army, loyal only to you, when your existing nobility and tribal warlords have their own ambitions, their own soldiers, and their own agendas? Traditional Turkic cavalry forces, drawn from Anatolian nobility, were powerful, but politically independent, men who fought for the Sultan, but who also answered to their own families, their own tribal loyalties, and their own interests. The solution the early Ottomans devised was radical for its time. Build an entirely new army from scratch, composed of men who owed absolutely nothing to any existing power structure inside the empire, no family estates, no tribal loyalties, no local nobility to answer to. These would be men whose entire identity, loyalty, and existence would be constructed and controlled directly by the Sultan himself. The result was a new elite infantry corps that came to be called the Janissary, literally new soldiers in Turkish, a name that would eventually be pronounced by European observers as Janissary. The system used to recruit these soldiers was as unusual as the force itself, and it became one of the most infamous institutions in Ottoman history. The devshirme, sometimes translated as the child levy, or blood tax. Ottoman officials would periodically travel through the empire's Christian territories, in the Balkans, regions like Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, and Greece, and select young boys, typically between the ages of 8 and 18, to be forcibly taken from their families and brought into Ottoman service. For the families involved, this was an unimaginable trauma, a state-sanctioned system of essentially kidnapping children, converting them to Islam, and raising them entirely within Ottoman institutions, deliberately severing their ties to their birth families, their original religion, and their native communities. Ottoman officials selected boys based on physical strength, intelligence, and apparent potential, often favoring boys from particular regions, believed to produce especially capable soldiers. Some historical accounts suggest that certain families, recognizing the potential for their sons to rise to genuine power and wealth within Ottoman society, a path largely closed to them, as poor rural Christians, occasionally viewed the devshirme with complicated, even reluctantly hopeful feelings, though this in no way erases the fundamental brutality of a system built on forced separation of children from their parents. Once selected, these boys entered one of history's most intensive and deliberately dehumanizing training pipelines. They were first sent to live and work with Turkish farming families in Anatolia, learning the Turkish language, converting to Islam, and adapting to a completely new cultural identity, effectively erasing much of their prior life before they ever picked up a weapon. After this initial period, the most promising boys were brought into specialized palace schools, where they underwent years of rigorous physical, military, and intellectual training. The training was brutal and comprehensive. Recruits learned combat skills, archery, and eventually firearms use, alongside education in Ottoman administration, Islamic theology, and multiple languages, depending on their assessed abilities and the roles they were being groomed for. The most exceptionally talented boys weren't necessarily funneled into purely military roles at all. Some were selected for administrative training that could eventually lead to positions as provincial governors, grand viziers, or other senior officials within the Ottoman state, meaning a captured Christian peasant boy could, in theory, rise to become one of the most powerful men in the empire. This wasn't mere propaganda. It happened repeatedly throughout Ottoman history, making the devshirme system a bizarre combination of brutal trauma and, for those who survived and excelled, one of the most powerful social mobility systems in the pre-modern world. Crucially, Janissaries existed within a unique legal and social category. They were technically slaves of the Sultan, in Ottoman terminology, but this status came with privileges and prestige that far exceeded typical conceptions of slavery. They were forbidden from marrying or having families for much of the Corps' early history, forbidden from engaging in trade or owning significant property, and required to live communally, in barracks, entirely dependent on and loyal to the Sultan for their pay, food, and standing. The theory behind this system was elegant in its ruthlessness. Men with no family, no property, and no independent economic base had no competing loyalties whatsoever. Their entire existence, identity, and survival were tied directly to continued service and loyalty to the Ottoman throne. On the battlefield, this training and structure produced something genuinely unprecedented for its era. A standing, professional, disciplined infantry force, paid regular wages, and maintained year-round, at a time when most European armies still relied heavily on feudal levies, mercenaries, and seasonal campaigns. Janissaries were equipped, early on, with firearms, becoming some of the first disciplined infantry corps in the world to make gunpowder weapons a central part of their standard tactics, giving the Ottoman military a significant technological and organizational edge over many of its rivals. For generations, for roughly 2 centuries, the Janissaries formed the backbone of Ottoman military success. Across an extraordinary run of conquest, they played a central role in the siege of Constantinople in 1453, providing the disciplined infantry corps that helped Mehmed the Conqueror finally break through walls that had withstood 1,000 years of previous attempts. They fought in the campaigns that expanded Ottoman control deep into the Balkans, across much of the Middle East, and into North Africa. They stood at the heart of Sultan Selim the Grim's devastating victories over the Safavid Persians at Calderon and the Mamluks at Marj Dabik and Redania, campaigns that doubled the size of the empire within less than a decade. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, Janissaries participated in some of the most famous Ottoman military campaigns in history, including the sieges of Belgrade and Rhodes and the pivotal Battle of Mohacs, which shattered the Kingdom of Hungary and pushed Ottoman power deep into Central Europe. European military observers of the era frequently wrote, with a mixture of admiration and genuine terror, about Janissary discipline, uniformity, and battlefield effectiveness, describing troops who advanced in coordinated ranks, followed orders with a precision rarely seen among the era's often chaotic feudal armies, and fought with a ferocity that seemed to stem from genuine institutional pride rather than simple coercion. For roughly 200 years, the Janissaries weren't just soldiers, they were arguably the single most effective military institution on the planet. But institutions built on rigid, artificial constraints tend to erode over time, and the Janissary Corps was no exception. By the late 1500s and into the 1600s, a series of gradual, but ultimately catastrophic changes began transforming the Corps from within. The prohibition on marriage was gradually relaxed and eventually abandoned entirely, allowing Janissaries to marry and have children. Almost immediately, a new pressure emerged. Fathers wanted their own sons to inherit their privileged positions within the Corps, rather than seeing those positions go to newly recruited outsiders through the traditional devshirme system. Over time, this pressure fundamentally transformed how the Janissary Corps recruited its members. Instead of remaining an elite force built entirely from carefully selected, rigorously trained outsiders with no competing loyalties, the Corps increasingly became hereditary, with sons succeeding fathers, regardless of actual military aptitude or willingness to serve. The devshirme system itself gradually fell into disuse by the late 1600s and effectively ended entirely by the early 1700s, replaced by a corps largely comprised of men born into their positions, many of whom had never seen real combat and had little genuine interest in the grueling training and battlefield discipline that had defined earlier generations. Alongside this hereditary shift came another major transformation. Janissaries increasingly abandoned their original prohibition against outside economic activity, and many began engaging heavily in trade, craft guilds, and business ventures throughout Istanbul and other major Ottoman cities. For individual Janissaries, this often proved enormously profitable. Many became wealthy merchants and property owners, using their privileged legal status, tax exemptions, and institutional connections to gain significant advantages over ordinary civilian competitors. But, for the empire as a whole, this economic transformation proved deeply corrosive to military effectiveness. Men who spent most of their time managing shops, running workshops, and pursuing business interests had little motivation to maintain rigorous military training or accept the hardships of extended, dangerous military campaigns. The corps that had once represented the cutting edge of professional, disciplined warfare gradually became bloated with members who were, in practice, civilian businessmen, holding on to military privileges and generous state salaries, while contributing increasingly little actual military value in return. As their military discipline eroded, the Janissaries discovered a new and dangerous source of power: political leverage, concentrated heavily in Istanbul, organizationally cohesive and acutely aware of their own historical prestige and the state's dependence on their nominal loyalty. Janissaries increasingly began intervening directly in Ottoman political succession and governance, essentially functioning as kingmakers, capable of deposing sultans and grand viziers who threatened their privileges or failed to meet their demands. Throughout the 1600s and 1700s, Janissary revolts became a recurring and devastating feature of Ottoman political life. Sultans who attempted to cut Janissary pay, reduce their numbers, reform their privileges, or modernize the military along European lines frequently faced violent uprisings, and several Ottoman sultans were forcibly deposed, imprisoned, or even executed as a direct result of Janissary rebellion. The very institution, originally designed to be the ultimate expression of absolute royal loyalty, had transformed into one of the greatest internal threats to royal authority in the entire empire, a heavily armed, politically organized force that the sultans themselves increasingly feared rather than commanded. By the 1700s, as European militaries underwent dramatic modernization, adopting new infantry tactics, more effective artillery, standardized training, and increasingly sophisticated logistics and command structures, the Janissary corps largely failed to keep pace, weighed down by internal resistance to reform, entrenched hereditary privilege, and leadership more interested in preserving traditional status than in adapting to genuinely new military realities. Ottoman forces began suffering a series of humiliating defeats against European rivals, particularly Russia and Austria, that would have been almost unthinkable a century earlier. Ottoman sultans and reform-minded officials increasingly recognized that the Janissary corps had become not just militarily obsolete, but actively obstructive to any attempt at meaningful modernization. Any effort to introduce modern European-style training, weapons, or organizational reforms was consistently met with fierce, often violent, Janissary resistance, since such reforms directly threatened their inflated privileges, guaranteed salaries, and inflated numbers on the payroll, numbers that, by some estimates, included many thousands of men who existed only on paper, their pay quietly pocketed by corrupt officers while providing zero actual military service. The most serious and consequential attempt to fundamentally challenge Janissary power came under Sultan Selim III, who ascended the throne in 1789, deeply committed to comprehensive military modernization. Selim established an entirely new, separately organized military force called the Nizam-i-Seded, the New Order, trained and equipped along modern European lines, intended eventually to replace the increasingly dysfunctional Janissary corps as the empire's primary military force. The Janissaries, recognizing this new force as a direct existential threat to their privileged position, reacted with fury. In 1807, Janissary units, backed by conservative religious authorities, deeply suspicious of European-style reforms, rose up in open rebellion against Selim's modernization program. The revolt succeeded catastrophically. For the reform movement, Selim was deposed and later murdered. The Nizami-setted force was disbanded, and meaningful Ottoman military modernization was set back by decades. It was a stark demonstration of exactly how dangerous the Janissary Corps had become, not as a fighting force against the empire's external enemies, but as an internal veto power capable of blocking almost any reform that threatened their entrenched position. Selim's cousin and eventual successor, Sultan Mahmud II, watched these events unfold with careful, long-term calculation, rather than repeating Selim's mistake of confronting the Janissaries too directly and too quickly. Mahmud spent years patiently consolidating his own power, cultivating loyal allies within the religious establishment and military leadership, and quietly preparing the political and military groundwork necessary to finally, decisively break Janissary power once and for all. By 1826, Mahmud judged that the moment had finally arrived. He began establishing a new, modernized military force, framing it carefully and deliberately as operating alongside the existing Janissary Corps, rather than as an explicit replacement, at least initially, an approach designed specifically to avoid triggering the kind of immediate, violent backlash that had destroyed Selim's earlier reform attempt. Was a calculated trap, and the Janissaries, sensing the same existential threat, regardless of Mahmud's careful framing, took the bait. In June 1826, exactly as Mahmud had anticipated, the Janissaries rose in rebellion against the new military reforms, following the same rebellious playbook that had worked so effectively against previous sultans for generations. But this time, everything was different. Mahmud had spent years carefully preparing precisely for this moment. Loyal, modernized artillery units and other military forces that Mahmud had quietly built up and positioned in advance moved swiftly against the rebelling Janissaries, trapping large numbers of them within their own barracks in Istanbul. What followed was swift and utterly devastating. Artillery bombardment set the Janissary barracks ablaze, and thousands of Janissaries were killed in the fighting and the subsequent fires, while additional purges rapidly spread throughout the empire, systematically hunting down and executing surviving Janissaries and their sympathizers. In the following days and weeks, the corps that had once conquered Constantinople, crushed the Mamluks, and terrified European armies for centuries, was formally, permanently abolished by imperial decree within days of the uprising's brutal suppression. Ottoman chroniclers, with a mixture of relief and grim satisfaction, would later refer to this violent purge by a strikingly ironic name: the Auspicious Incident. The destruction of the Janissary Corps in 1826 marked one of the most dramatic institutional turning points in Ottoman history, finally clearing the way for genuine, sustained military and administrative modernization efforts that would continue, with mixed and often difficult results, throughout the rest of the empire's existence into the 20th century. For Mahmud II, the Auspicious Incident represented the culmination of years of patient political calculation, finally breaking the grip of an institution that had become, in the starkest possible terms, more dangerous to the Sultan's authority than almost any foreign enemy the empire faced. Yet, the Janissary's broader historical legacy remains genuinely complicated and difficult to reduce to a single simple narrative. For roughly the first 2 centuries of their existence, they represented one of the most effective, disciplined, and genuinely revolutionary military institutions in the pre-modern world, built from an almost unimaginably brutal system of forced child conscription, yet capable of producing soldiers, administrators, and grand viziers of extraordinary skill and loyalty. For the final century and a half of their existence, that same institution gradually transformed into something closer to a self-serving, entrenched interest group, actively resisting the very modernization the empire desperately needed to survive against increasingly powerful European rivals. The Janissaries were, in the truest sense, both the sword that built the Ottoman Empire and eventually one of the chains that helped hold it back from adapting to a rapidly changing world. The Janissaries went from history's most feared soldiers to an empire's biggest internal threat, And it took a sultan, patient enough, to wait years, for the perfect moment, to finally end them. But the Ottoman story, of power, reform, and rebellion, is far from over. If you want to see how the empire tried to rebuild itself after this bloody turning point, subscribe and hit the bell, because next time, we're covering the reforms that tried to drag the Ottoman Empire into the modern world.